Welcome to Soundbreaker. In today's episode, we're talking to Chris McMurtry. I want to pronounce his name right, who is a groundbreaker in the music industry. Thanks for joining us, Chris. And for our listeners who might not be familiar with you, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into it?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Chris McMurtry. I'm the Vice President of Product at Artist Growth here in Nashville, Tennessee. Born and raised here in Nashville, despite all of the Florida apparel that you see that I have. But yeah, being born and raised here in Nashville, I've been in music my whole life.
Great. So, Chris, before we dive into it and start getting more detail on what are you doing, what you invented, what you started, can we go back to can you take us back to your earlier days in teenage? How did your love for music, and was it influenced by anybody in school, by family members, mom, dad,
Sure.
uncle, a group, a band?
Yeah, absolutely. If we go way back to like
Yes,
elementary school,
absolutely.
to give you an idea of what it's like growing up in Nashville, if you're familiar with the bluegrass mandolin player Ricky Skaggs,
Uh-huh.
um, uh, his uh, his sons were in my class and we were on the same bus.
Uh-huh.
And the reason I bring that up is because you don't think about it, but you're just surrounded by music all the time. And it wasn't uncommon for us to go in Ricky's studio and just start messing around or, or somebody else's studio. So we were always around music. In fact, I remember the first trip that I took outside of Nashville was with my cousin, and we went to like Oklahoma City or something like that. And the house we were staying in, I started looking around for the piano and for guitars and because it was the first time I'd ever been in a house that didn't have musical instruments. In Nashville, just always surrounded by it. I was doing session work, kind of major session work as early as 15, mostly for guitar. I've gotten to do a ton of session work, I guess most famously for the Backstreet Boys.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. so
Wow.
that's,
Okay.
Andy Warhol was right, right? It's like everybody's got 15 minutes.
Yes.
Um, so I was doing session work, but ultimately, I ended up being a touring musician, and that's what I loved. I loved performing, and it was while on the road that I fell in love with classical music and decided I wanted to be a classical composer, and that's what I ultimately, not directly out of high school, but when I quit the band, I went to school to become a classical composer.
Very interesting. I like that. Chris, starting with your bachelor in the music theory and
Yep.
and composition in Tennessee. How did your educational background, lay the foundation for your career in the music industry?
Yeah, as far as music goes, the best education you can have is just playing with people as much as you possibly can, right? You cannot there is no substitute for that human connection and that magic that happens when you're performing together. But as far as the way that classical music prepared me in a way that I didn't expect is
Mm.
a couple things. One I'm now a product manager, but also a developer. And I've found that music theory majors make really good engineers, right?
Mm.
Because they're used to playing or paying attention to the details. But also, as musicians, you they tend to listen better, right? And listen to others and be empathetic and to consider other perspectives. So that would be one way, but more specific. Um, by focusing on classical music, it really took me down a path that I never could have expected or predicted. And that I'm happy to get into the full story, but the long story short is that there wasn't anyone really focused on classical music metadata and the distribution of classical music for independent composers like myself.
Hmm.
And the reason there wasn't anyone focused, like as a tune core for classical, for example, was because the metadata was so complex. And so that wasn't an intentional thing where I'm just like, I'm going to focus on the hardest problem. Like I was just wanting to get my music and the label that I ended up co-founding to get
Hmm.
that music out into the world. And in so doing, we had to meet the metadata specifications of Apple and Spotify and Amazon and Google, YouTube, right? And that was quite a bit more complex than your typical pop spec or like non-classical music spec. And in order to do that at scale, we had to figure out how to automate it, and that's ultimately what has served my career well is by just focusing on classical music. It led to a lot of the algorithms that are
Got it.
used in the industry today.
I mean, classical music has the most complex or intense metadata. I,
Yeah,
as a music distributor for many years at a label and all of that, one of the things I always wanted to distribute it, but my fear was, what about the metadata? That's like, you need, before automation came to me, it was like, I need to have a special team just to organize the metadata for each release.
that's exactly
Too
right. So
many,
you know
too
exactly what
many
I'm talking about.
details.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I do, but maybe our listeners might not be familiar with. So that's why, I asked some of the questions just to kind of detail it more for the listeners and our viewers.
Yeah,
But
so
yes,
if you want, I'll explain it real quick.
please.
I have so my favorite piece is Beethoven's Third Symphony, and so
Yeah.
I always use that as an example. But if you think
Yes.
of standard metadata for releases, generally album, artist, song title, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Taylor Swift, 1989, Shake It Off, right? But to
Yes.
do that for classical, Beethoven's Third, Ludwig van Beethoven, Symphony Number 3 in E flat major, Opus 55, Eroica, Movement Number 1, Allegro con brio, as conducted by, as performed by, right, on, and then that level of detail. But even in that example, we rattled off three languages, right? And then what's the casing for those languages, right? And how are you going to fit all of that on an iPhone screen? Like so. Um, that's
I
that
mean,
complexity. Yeah.
for publishers, it must be a nightmare to pay
Yeah,
each person and everything. It is, isn't it?
it
I
is
mean,
absolutely, and then there are questions of is it in the public domain or not? It's not always as simple as life of the creator plus 70 years. Like it could be an arrangement, right? Or there could have that copyright could have been reinstated in some way, right? So
hmm,
being able to
wow.
account for the publishing is extremely difficult. So.
Yes. It's like taking a slice of cake and slicing it extremely thin slices to kind of divide it to everybody. Wow. With your significant work at PEX, focusing on rights management online, how
Mhm.
does this technology benefit artists and creators in protecting and monetizing their content?
Yeah, so I love that you were getting into the cake and each individual slice.
Yes.
This day and age, we're dealing with instead of like the cake and slices, we're dealing with the ingredients that make up the cake, right?
Whew.
So
Yes.
so and that's what PEX is really good at, and frankly, I could say this unbiased now because I'm now at Artist Growth, but unbiased, it is the most impressive technology that I have ever been a part of.
Wow.
And that includes my
Pecs.
work at Apple.
Uh huh.
And it's because, those individual ingredients. So you think of the stems, right?
Yes.
That go into a session. But what
Yeah.
if it has been sped up or slowed down, which is like a huge trend now, right? People are,
Yes.
like
Yeah.
creating nightcore versions of songs and releasing it as their own. Well, that
Yeah.
money is not getting back to the original
Yes.
composer or even the master
Yes.
recording artist, right? So the ability to be able to recognize something in as little as 500 milliseconds, and
Yeah.
even if it's sped up or slowed down, as well as live versions or cover versions, like PEX's technology is able to recognize all of that.
Yes. That's amazing. That's really amazing. Diving into metadata challenges, especially with dot music's focus on classical genres, what major obstacles have you encountered, and what feature development do you anticipate in this area?
Yes, you said future development, and I just want to make
Yes,
sure. Excellent,
yes,
good deal.
yes. Developments do you anticipate in the in this
Yeah,
area? Yes.
yeah. So I'll start with future, because
Or you could start with the obstacles that
okay, sure,
have you
yeah,
encountered.
yeah.
Yes, yes,
Well, so as
and
far as
then
the
we'll jump into it.
obstacles,
Hmm.
yeah, as far as the obstacles encountered, um, when you look at in the industry, we call them DSPs, digital service providers, but depending on your audience, it might be easiest
Yes,
to just refer to them as streaming services, right?
yes,
So depending on the specifications of Apple Music or
yes,
Spotify or YouTube, what's interesting is they're all different. Like there is no uniform specification that everyone should meet, right?
hmm,
And the reason for that is because they are rightly so focused on their business and their end users. And so the
yeah,
specification for like a TikTok is going to be different than the
yeah,
specification that you would want in Apple Music.
yes.
And so the hard part, the first obstacle is we touched on it a little bit, and I like all the effects. We touched on it a little bit with the breadth and depth of the metadata, right? That
Yes,
Ludwig von Beethoven, Symphony Number 3 in E flat major, Allegro con brio,
yes,
right? But then
yeah,
you have what about crediting all of the individuals that are contributing to that, right? So
yes, absolutely. They're
um,
part of the whole
uh,
thing.
exactly. And what's interesting is, this day and age, especially outside of the US,
Hmm.
I do feel like Europe is a bit more progressive in when it comes to royalties, and specifically with neighboring rights, what they refer to as neighboring rights. And
Correct.
Sound Exchange here in the US does collect on neighboring rights, but they tend to focus more on like SiriusXM and Pandora, right? But
Hmm.
where I'm going with all of that is if you are an audible contributor
Hmm.
to a recording, to something that is being listened to,
Hmm.
then you are owed a neighboring right. And so a lot of musicians don't realize this. And the reason I say it's an obstacle with classical music is there are a lot of contributors when it comes to classical, right?
Yes,
You know,
yes,
so so
yeah,
getting credit and making sure credit is given,
yeah.
for those recordings, but also accounting for it and making sure that metadata goes with all the different various places that it's being consumed and listened to. So the breadth of that is an obstacle, right?
Okay.
But then also the depth, which I would describe as just different specifications. So making sure that Apple gets what they want and Spotify gets what they want, and so that remuneration can happen there.
Should be. I mean, you mentioned something earlier for the answer, an obstacle that you touched on, that every DSP, or digital streaming platform or digital streaming provider, have their own metadata.
Hmm.
They're not all aligned the same way. It's
That's right.
a now obviously it's a problem. Shouldn't it be all one universal metadata for whatever genre of music? Obviously, if it's
Yep.
classical, this is. If it's pop, if it's rock, if it's urban, hip hop, R&B, blah blah blah, jazz,
Yeah.
country, and all of that.
Yeah,
Should it?
ideally there should be, and
Uh-huh.
you probably remember and recall the GRD, the Global Rights Database, and
Yeah.
that was an attempt to create a data set that everyone could access that would have this information, and
Okay.
it was an absolute failure.
Why?
The stakeholders involved in creating that database
Uh-huh.
could not agree, and that is a commonality in the music industry to where Universal might not agree with Warner, might not agree with Sony, might not agree with the independents, right?
But that will
So there was
protect everybody: the publishers, the writers, the composers, the artists, whoever's involved. Their
yeah,
shares, their earnings, copyright. Even it's easier to. Okay,
yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Hmm.
and so everyone, I don't want to just say they, right, but everyone was more focused on protecting their own business
Hmm.
rather than the rising tide lifting all boats, which is, ultimately why, the government had to get involved and create the MLC. And so we are seeing some sea change a bit, right? To
Got it.
where
Yeah.
if you go to the MLC, the Mechanical Licensing Collective, you go to their site, all of their data is available. They're making it available. And so,
Hmm.
they are really one of the first, if not the only, that are sharing their data. And so I do think that, you asked, what in the future do I see changing? I
Yes.
do see
Yes.
data becoming more available and more proliferated throughout the industry. And this whole attitude of, hey, this is mine, even though it's technically public information, and it's just like, hey, Chris McMurtry played guitar for the Backstreet Boys. That is public information that can go out there, right?
Hmm.
So providing some definitions around what is public and what is private
Yes.
will help. But also, this is part of, I don't know if we want to go down the AI rabbit hole or not, but, this
We
is
will
part
in the
of,
next question, though. But
okay,
definitely,
cool.
yes. Yes.
But, like, there's this huge debate that's happening right now, of course, around, chat GPT and,
Yes.
basically making the world's data available.
Through
And so,
ChatGPT.
exactly, and ChatGPT is one of many, right? But it's almost like a verb now. You can use it to describe an LLM.
Got
So
it.
um,
Chris, considering your extensive experience with metadata in the music industry, how do you envision AI contributing contributing to solving these complex issues? Which we just answered in the next question.
sure, yeah, yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. So really, it is about the data, right? And
Hmm.
there are valid concerns when it comes to IP, intellectual property, and
If you don't mind, I need you to be a little more detailed. I know how it works, but for our listeners and viewers,
oh,
just to
sure.
because this is a subject that very intriguing and very interesting and very important, obviously, to artists, to labels, to independent distributors, to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I went to school to learn
Yeah.
about classical music, right?
Yeah.
I spent 4 years, right? Like
Yes.
diving in to the masters, right, and
Yes.
getting as much information from them as I can, right?
Yeah.
And I still have all my textbooks, right, and I reference them often, right? Whether it's orchestration or
Yes.
harmony, right? So just like I, as a human being, an individual, in
Yeah.
order to learn about classical music, did that. A large language model does that, but it's across everything, right? And
Hmm.
you're able to, just like the human mind is able to learn and process that information that I'm learning from the textbooks and from my professors. The large language model is able to do this across all of the data that it's been given in
Hmm.
seconds. So instead of 4 years, right, it's seconds, and it's potentially even better, right?
Correct.
So um, I'm sure most of your listeners have heard of or have used, like Midjourney, right? Which is for generating artwork. And so
Hmm.
what Midjourney has done is used all of the visual art that it's been able to get its hands on, or been given. And then when you describe what you're looking for, it can, like take reference from, like various artists, and come up with something unique that is a
Hmm.
little bit of everything from that. So um, in terms of music, the same thing is now starting to happen to where, I could be like, play Barbie Girl in the style of Johnny Cash. And so it'll take the lyrics from Barbie Girl and then do it as if Johnny Cash were singing it, right?
Hmm.
So um, now I see this as a very promising thing when it comes to music metadata, because again, we're talking about, you know, and for your listeners, all we mean when we say metadata is data describing other data, right?
Hmm.
Um, uh, so uh, with metadata, instead of having to understand all the different specifications and be able to, gather all of this information, it can, especially when combined with algorithms like entity resolution,
Hmm.
it can give you an aggregated view of that data, that makes sure that the rights holder is credited and
Hmm.
ultimately remunerated for that. So I see that as very promising, particularly when it comes to metadata, as using large language models for metadata.
Hmm. Hmm. Anything else that you would think that would, use an AI that would kind of help metadata to be more aligned and organized and available? Not still,
Yeah,
I mean, a lot of metadata is a mess. A lot of artists, their metadata, and you know what that means. It means they're not going to get credit properly. They're not going to be accounted to properly. So that's why there's a lot of publishing money sits in limbo. I mean, as
that's right.
ASCAP, BMI, or publisher, they say there's, I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars, if there's even billions of dollars just sitting there. You know.
Yeah, billions. That's absolutely right. And the sad thing, well, sad depending on who you are, but is that, after a period of time, usually or 3 years, that money will be distributed to the market share. You know,
Wow.
um, which may give you some insight as to why the GRD might have failed.
Hmm. Okay. So okay, I didn't even know that, honestly. Being in the music business for a long time. I sound ignorant of my part, but wow, I didn't know that. It get distributed after 3 years?
It's distributed to the market share, so
And you
it get,
cannot claim it or not cannot be claimed. That's it, it's gone.
that's correct.
It's
It
like a
is.
lottery ticket. After a certain amount of time, it's gone,
Yep.
lost.
Yeah,
Wow, expires.
once it's given to the once it's distributed to the market share, which of course would be,
Yeah.
one of the majors, Universal, Warner, Sony, you cannot get that money. That's right.
Oh, I do want to continue that kind of bonus every 3 years. Wow. Okay, you heard it first on Sandbreaker. Uh,
You
now
did
at
say to
Artist
stay away
Growth.
from controversial things, though, so I
I
didn't know
do.
how far to go down that path. Uh,
Now you're at Artist Growth.
yep.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
By the way, yes, I hope it's not too late to congratulate you. How
Not
do
at
you
all.
plan to leverage your mix of musical knowledge and tech skills to enhance the platform's offerings for music and entertainment, industry?
Yeah, for sure. So really excited to be here at Artist Growth. It was definitely a tough decision to leave PEX. Bittersweet for sure, but it does feel like it's the right next step on my
I don't
path.
mean to get in personally. Were you
Sure.
part of PEX? Like, were you involved in the, how should I say, you had ownership with them, or
I
just,
did, yeah, yeah, and
yeah.
and and still do, and am rooting for that team. And
Uh-huh.
and some of my best friends are at PEX, and am very excited um, for what that technology. For all the problems that we're describing, that
Yes.
technology is key for the identification, right?
Great. Yeah.
So what I'm doing here at Artist Growth is going a little
Yes.
bit more downstream, and so my personal mission uh, has always been that data should not get in the way of attribution or payment, right?
Hmm.
And so that's why I ended up at PEX, was in order to attribute someone, you need to identify the usage. In order to pay someone, you need to identify the usage, right?
Yes.
So that technology is rocking and that's going. So now I'm going a step downstream to be with the creator, with the composer, with the writer, with the artist, right? And what artist growth has historically been and has an incredible business in, it's 12 years old, is in touring.
Hmm.
And it's a project management tool currently for touring, to where, it's keeping the artist and the label manager and the CFO at the label and the venue and the security at the venue and the tour manager and the bus driver, everyone on the same page, right?
Yes.
Using the same, the way that I like to say it, they're all singing from the same choir book, right? And on the same
Yeah.
page of the choir book. So that's project management at its finest. Well,
Uh-huh.
if you look at the if you read like what Mang from BandLab says, he's like, there are going to be a billion creators by
Hmm.
2026.
A billion
Some
creators.
Yeah, some people say 2030, but there's going to be a you know billion, an eighth of the population is going to be creating, right? Well, what's interesting about that is if you are putting your art into the world
Hmm.
and or your music, right, on streaming services,
Yeah.
you have a small business, right?
Hmm.
It may be a
Yes.
very small business or it may grow into a large small business. So what got me about Matt Ermey's the CEO of Artist Growth. What got me
Growth.
about his
Yeah.
vision was that, hey, every musician should have the opportunity to manage their business. What Artist Growth is doing in touring and what we're looking to do
Hmm.
in all facets of business is make project management for music as easy, as intuitive as possible. So we're using the same foundation in touring to aggregate various tools into that platform, so that if you're a composer and you want to, pitch to for various films and work with
Hmm.
a sync agent or a
Yes.
music supervisor, right? You just send them, your AG. You invite them to AG Artist Growth, and they can see your production schedule, right? And then they could provide you briefs and feedback. Or if you are a cover band, right? Maybe you're not like a touring band, but you're a cover band, and you're making, $2,000 every time you play a wedding, right?
Hmm.
You want to make sure everybody shows up for the rehearsal, right? So you invite your band, to that. So anywhere that you are creating music,
Yeah.
instead of using Asana.com or Monday.com and trying to make those tools work and do all these workarounds, we're building Artist Growth to basically be custom for you, right? So
Amazing. Amazing service. That's definitely an incredible journey you've had so far, Chris. Really.
thanks, man.
The music industry is known for its challenges and setbacks. Can you share a difficult moment you faced in your career and how did you overcome it?
Yeah. So it was one of the most, if not the most darkest period of my life. And you mentioned
Ooh,
our friend Tracy Maddox right
yes,
before we hopped on. He
yes.
was key in helping to pull me out of that dark place, and he did so by basically mentoring me and showing me that it's going to be okay. And what he had come to me about was he had read in Billboard that my company, Dart Music, was going through bankruptcy. So it was extremely difficult. It was extremely hard. And without people like Tracy Maddox or Mike Hurst at Exactuals, uh, uh, I don't think I was ever suicidal, but I do very vividly remember where I was when I was thinking, oh, that's what this feels like.
Uh-huh.
It would be a lot easier to just end it, right? And the most difficult thing I've ever gone through is that bankruptcy. And as far as how to overcome it, it was the community, the folks that just reached out to me and wrapped their arms around me and helped me and mentored me and guided me. You know.
Wow, definitely. We need to give, I guess, a lot of credit to also beside you that you had the mental strength to pull yourself and to accept the help from others, like Tracy Maddox and Michael also.
Yeah, Mike Hurst. Yeah,
Mike
yeah.
Hurst, yeah,
Yeah, and I also during that time, this was also helpful. Uh, Obviously, I was under a lot of stress and I didn't know what to do. And one day, I just took
yes,
off running. I just started running,
yes,
and I found that when I ran, I felt better. But
uh-huh.
also, I was able to get into a headspace and think about things, and I'd be like, "Oh, so that's not as bad as I thought. I could do this, this, and this." And I started, running a whole lot, and ended up running ultra marathons.
Wow.
And
So running was your how should I say creative studio, creative office.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And
Amazing.
it got to the point I was taking calls, using my AirPods while running, and I was running all the time, and it made a big difference in my stress level, but also
Wow.
just being able to process and think through the stuff that Tracy and Mike were telling me.
Well, I have to say this is one of the most interesting setback challenges question answer we had from any of our guests.
Oh,
But
thanks,
definitely,
man.
man, yes, kudos to you, my friend.
No,
Absolutely.
I'm very
Um,
grateful.
I appreciate you sharing with us. Very inspiring. In your opinion, what are the most common misconceptions people have about the music industry?
Hmm, that's a good question.
Yes.
The thing about the music industry
Yeah.
uh, is that anyone can do it. Like, like you can be an entrepreneur and build a company. You can jump in to royalties and work at a publisher or a
Hmm.
label. You can be in your 80s and be like, I want to learn the guitar, right? And start learning, watching YouTube videos and tablature, right? And teaching yourself those things. um, I know it's cliche, but music really is the universal language, right? It's something that everyone
Yes. Correct.
can relate on, right? And so uh, a misconception I think that folks have is that, oh, I'm not smart enough, or I'm not talented enough, or I'm too old, right? Like, here's what I found is if you focus on doing things for yourself and
Hmm.
because it brings you joy, or maybe to bring others joy, those things take care of themselves, right?
Yes.
And it may not be like superstar status, right? But but like, you can be successful in music. And I know the media, like, kind of glorifies a certain persona, right?
Yes.
But
Yeah.
that's not the music industry. That's just one facet of it, right? So
Yes. Collaboration is often a key element in the music world. Could you share a memorable collaboration story or someone you worked with that left an impact on you?
yeah, well, we've already mentioned Tracy and Mike.
And Mike Hertz,
So
yes.
yeah,
I
yeah.
was
So
going to say that.
um, I think that being on the road with my bandmates,
Yes.
um, being like some of we would play shows and there'd be thousands there, which is always fun. But we'd also play shows and there would be like two people there, right?
Yeah.
And and we would play just as hard and put on as big of a show as if we were playing to thousands, right? And that is
Hmm.
because we loved playing music with one another, right? And so
Correct.
there is something magical about performing live and performing with others. And you see that when you go see uh,
Yes.
a live musician, and there's a reason that people go to like 10 Dave Matthews Band shows in a year, right? Is because they know every one of them is going to be different, right? And
Hmm.
it's going to be a different experience. So, I could go on and on about, I could dive into specifics, but man, just live music and being able to perform live together is a, uh, it's a special, special thing.
Great. Technology has significantly changed the music landscape. How have advancement in technology influenced your work and the music industry as a whole?
Yeah. So, um, as you know, I mentioned earlier, I was a classical composer,
Hmm.
or I am a classical composer, and went to school for classical music. The reason I said was just because I was thinking about when I was studying,
Hmm.
and I would write a piece and I would notate it all out, and I would give it to to the orchestra or the ensemble that I was working with, and they would play it, and it would, parts of it would sound amazing and was exactly what I intended, but other parts of it I was just like, oh, what is that, right? And then um, it's a big expensive thing to then have to go and make your edits and then give it back to him and be like, well, that's kind of like it, but let me change this, right? It's it's not as possible as feasible. But
Yeah.
with software instruments, I have an entire orchestra in this computer, and it will never replace that human element that I just talked about with playing live. But I can now iterate on my compositions.
Hmm.
And like the last piece I just did for this cartoon, there were 26 iterations on that, right?
Wow.
Like, and it was full orchestra and everything, and it sounded great. It turned out great. Now, the hope is that an orchestra will actually perform it, right? But it
Yeah.
sounds pretty darn good the way it is now, and I'm very proud of it, and my daughters love it, and so just, I think the biggest advance is just being able to realize what you feel you hear in your head or feel in your heart, right?
Hmm.
Being able to realize that much quicker.
Interesting. In your line of work, how do you stay updated to the latest trends, innovations, changes in the industry, and how important it is for you to continue to learn?
Um, Sorry, hold on one second. I know we're over, so let me just let my next meeting know.
Sure.
I hope Alex can edit this. All right. Cool. So, do you mind repeating the question? I got distracted.
Absolutely. How do you stay updated to the latest trends,
Yeah.
innovations in
Yep.
the music and changes in the music industry, and how important it is for you to continue to learn?
Yeah. So I'm very fortunate in that I live in Nashville,
Hmm.
and the like I've been in remote companies for the last 10, 12 years, like
Hmm.
long before the pandemic.
Yes.
And and I love working remote. Like, it's very, very cool. And I'm able to get a lot done. Um, but you cannot beat human interaction, right?
Yes.
And so even though I work remote and I live about 30 miles south of Nashville, I come into Nashville all the time,
Hmm.
meeting with companies, meeting with colleagues, going to shows, right? And so the short answer is you interact with people, you talk to them, right? You
Yes.
get out there and you're like, hey, what are you working on, right? And then inevitably things come up. It's just like, dude, have you seen this chat gpt thing? Like, no. Then what's that? And then, like, and then they start talking about it, and then you
Yes.
dig in more and more. That was a bad example because that's kind of everywhere, right? But and then you're just like, I wonder if that can help me, or I wonder if I can use that, or I wonder if we can use that here at Artist Growth, or whatever that is. Then you start diving in, with that. So I don't. really ever watch the news. Actually, I never watched the news. I read an amazing book called "Amusing Ourselves to Death" years ago.
Yeah.
And I haven't watched since then. But I do rely on people telling me about events that are important. And when you are meeting with other entrepreneurs and other technology companies and going to shows and talking to people, they'll
Mm.
tell you what's important. And so that's how I recommend staying up to date on everything.
Human interactions,
Yep.
always, constantly. Um, a lot of our listeners and viewers are going to be inspired by your story, your path, and what you went through. And some of them might not want to do the same thing, but always inspiring and motivating for others who want to say, hey, you know what? Look what he went through and he did it. And I would, I want to take the same path. What advice, especially in a gatekeeping industry that we in?
Hmm.
So, what advice you would have for anybody who's inspired, who was trying to get into the business, and not as an artist and a musician, but different aspects and different sides of it, like yourself?
Yeah. My advice now is probably different than if you had asked me 5 years ago.
Yes.
And so this answer even now surprises me, which is because I used to hate sleep, but
Hmm.
um, make sure you get sleep, make sure you get exercise, um, make sure you are not alone, that you talk to people. And when you realize what that passion is, what you were put on the planet for,
Yes.
say no to everything but that, right?
Wow.
Everything needs
Interesting.
to point back to that. I'll just tell you a really quick story.
Please.
When Steve got sick the second time at Apple, he called us
Yeah.
all into an all hands, and he was
Hmm.
like, "I just want to thank you." Um, and he was like, "This has been an amazing journey." It was clear it was the end, and it was very sad. He was like, "This has
Hmm.
been an amazing journey,
Wow.
and if you were put on this planet to help me realize that, thank you." Or he's like, he said, "You need to stay here. You need to stay at Apple if that's why you were put on the planet." He's like, "But I know many of you were put here because you have something you're supposed to do." And that was like a dagger to my heart, because I was like, how in the world am I going to? I have these two passions, classical music and technology. How in the world am I going to be able to do both of those? Right. But from that moment on, I knew I had to find a way to work in classical music and work in technology.
Hmm.
And so, everything else is peripheral. You got to protect your time. It's your most valuable asset. And so make
Absolutely.
sure everything you're doing is somehow pointing back, either one of two things, pointing back to your love, your passion, or is helping someone else achieve theirs, which will come back, for,
Yes.
tenfold for you.
Great advice. Great advice for our listeners here at Soundbreakers. Um, let's see. Before, I mean, this has been a great interview. Before we wrap it up, anything that you would like to mention or speak about or advertise that you're working on and something coming soon,
Yeah,
or yeah,
yeah. Thank you
please.
for asking that, and please know
Absolutely.
I don't mean this self-serving,
No.
but we're about to take Artist Growth Workspace from just touring into
Hmm.
helping anyone who's in music be able to manage their business. And again, like, if you're doing anything, you have a business, right? If people are consuming it, you have a business. So I'm a VP of product, which means that I'm responsible for the experience, and the only way for to know the experience is to hear it from those that are actually trying to do music, right? So please go to artistgrowth.com and click on try workspace. It's free. If you shoot me an email, chris.mcmurtry at artistgrowth.com, there are things I can do to help make sure it stays free for a lot longer than the 14 days. But we need to know how it can help and what pain points, your listeners are having, so that we build it to the right specification. That would be extremely helpful.
Great. So everybody heard this. Run to your browser, type in artistgrowth.com, and you know the rest. And you can reach to Chris. Make sure you can reach out to Chris.
Thank
I
you,
don't
Bob.
have your. I don't remember your email, but
It's just
you,
my name,
yeah,
chris.mcmurtry at artistgrowth.com. Yeah.
that's it. That's
But
it.
even if you put something in the chat, it'll get to me. Just
Uh,
whatever's easiest for you. So
well, first of all, a lot of our great interviews, I hate to end them. I really do, because I myself enjoy the information and the knowledge and the conversation that comes out of it. But unfortunately, all great things had to come to an end. That concludes our show for today. So thank you for joining us, first of all, and at Soundbreaker. And please make sure to follow us on socials and stay tuned for our new episodes. See you, and thank you very much.
Bob, thank you so much, man. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, Chris. Really my pleasure. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to share the Soundbreaker podcast. And if you are joining us on YouTube, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time.